Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on to the last session of this conference. If you could have a seat, we'll get started. So this is a NITRD panel on cyber-physical systems and security. My name is Thomas Vagon. I'm the Cybersecurity R&D Coordinator at the National Coordination Office for the Networking and IT R&D, a federal program that coordinates investments and strategies in the federal government within the research in IT, including cybersecurity. So in the past, the NITRD has participated in this conference with panels and other events, and we appreciate being able to be here at this conference and bring up a topic that's of increasing importance within the federal government research community. So I'll start with the obvious, which is cyber-physical systems are a big deal, and that's why we're here. We have a panel of experts assembled that will give you perspectives on what are some of the latest activities within the federal government with respect to research in CPS. We'll hear from NSF, from DHS, and from NIST representatives, and also provide other perspectives from the industry as well as from the academia in terms of objectives and priorities for research within this domain. So what we'll do initially is each panelist has a few slides for a couple of opening remarks to share with you what's important to them and what's on their mind for this panel. After we go through that, we will then proceed to the open panel session, if you will, with opportunities for questions from the audience as well as questions among the panelists and from myself. So as the panelists give you their sort of view of some of the points they like to share, you can start sort of formulating your questions, and we hope that you will take the opportunity to ask questions, make comments, and discuss issues related to cyber-physical systems, cyber-physical systems and security, because indeed it's a big deal. There is an increasing level of investments and coordination within the federal government, which also translates to some of the work that you have the opportunity to participate in. And with that, I will turn it over to our first panelist, David Corman. He's the Program Officer and CPS Lead from National Science Foundation, from the SCIES Directorate. And you can come here or you can do it from there. Okay.
Thank you, Tomas. So, as he said, securing cyber-physical systems is a really big deal. At NSF, we've had a CPS program ongoing for probably 5 or 6 years now. And for the last probably 2 years, we've been very interested in technologies and research in the area of how do we develop secure cyber-physical systems. This year, if you're following the solicitations, we have a solicitation with proposals due June 2nd, and that includes some special attention in the area of secure cyber-physical systems, and includes, for the first time on the CPS program, a joint solicitation that includes Department of Homeland Security and Department of Transportation. So, in order to just talk very briefly, what do we really mean by CPS? So cyber-physical systems have cyber, so that's communications, computation, and control. They interact with the physical world. They sense the physical world. They have actuation that operates capabilities. And the important thing that we have to remember is because they operate in the physical world, their behavior is really constrained by the laws of physics. So it's a very important characteristic, and one that we think is important as we start to talk about how do we develop secure cyber-physical systems. So CPS are cyber capability in every physical component. They're tightly integrated capabilities. So the computing, the control, the sensing, and the networking are very tightly coupled. The time scales can vary from very short time scales on the order of milliseconds or microseconds to time scales when human operators are involved in the behavior, in the order of seconds or more. They're also complex in that they exist at both many temporal as well as many spatial scales. So if you look at systems that are deployed on airplanes or automobiles or bridges for structural health monitoring, the capabilities may exist at very short distance or also at very long distances. High degrees of automation scales, control loops are closed at many different levels, and they may have very different and very unconventional substrates, including some of biological, some nanochemical, et cetera. And what's very important, and one that was pointed out very earlier today in the discussion, for years we've talked about safety of cyber-physical systems, and there are all types of regulations with the FAA, the Department of Transportation, on how to design and develop safe cyber-physical systems in those domains. What we haven't really had is a lot of research, a lot of technical discussion on how to actually build secure cyber-physical systems. So a couple things that we'll talk about throughout the discussion today is what makes things different in the world of cyber-physical systems. So the solutions need to be lightweight. When we look at that, we're not dealing with very large enterprise systems, which are maybe perhaps too processor intensive, too power intensive, and are not going to be very applicable. The systems that we talk about have human operators frequently that interact with them. And these human operators are people like pilots, drivers, doctors, nurses, people in the manufacturing domain. The point is they're not system administrators, and that the security decisions have to be presented to them in a form that they can understand, and not force them to be the administrators or do forensics on a false detection. So the problem there is, of course, the operator's doing other things like driving a car, flying an airplane, operating a CNC machine. When we look at today's systems, if you're your own computer systems, you log your system's logged in, and it's getting updates of antivirus and other detections, other malware detection capability. When you look at cyber-physical systems, they may be embedded deeply into some systems, and it's very difficult to provide updates to them. So security solutions that require updates or interactions with a home base may not be very practical. And one of the points that I particularly am concerned about is, what do we do when we defend? How do we really defend these cyber-physical systems? And what does the concept of resilience and mission assurance really mean? It's easy to develop some anecdotal definitions, but in terms of research, it's hard to be very precise. And finally, a last thought is, when we talk about cyber-physical systems, the laws of physics don't change. And so the question that I ask, and I think is one of interest here, can we really treat the physical world as our friend in the area of CPS security? Thank you.
Thank you, David. For the next presenter, for just opening statements, we'll have Victoria Piliteri. She's the Smart Grid Cybersecurity and Cyber-Physical Systems Security Lead at NIST and Chair of the SGIP, the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel. I think I said that right. Cybersecurity Committee lead for that. So Vicky, would you like to come here? Or?
Sure, I guess so.
Okay.
I have bad luck with these. Thank you, everyone. As Thomas mentioned, my name is Vicky Piliteri, and I'm from the Computer Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I hail from the division that's developed such publications, including Guidelines to Smart Grid Cybersecurity, Guide to Industrial Control System Security, Security and Privacy Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations. We do a lot of cybersecurity work. So I'm here to talk a little bit about NIST Cyber-Physical Systems Public Working Group, which is an effort that's being developed in partnership with NIST's Engineering Laboratory under the direction of Chris Greer, the Director of Smart Grid and Cyber-Physical Systems Program Office. So, the NIST initiative in CPS will provide scalable design strategies based on new standards for integrating architectural layers and hyper-complex CPSs for connecting multiple CPSs from the component level, for example in composite medical systems, to the continental scale, the smart grid, and a focus on robust science-based metrics and agile research and testing platforms for integrated CPS performance measurement and management. So the long and the short of it is we're going to be starting off an initiative to create a new forum to help break down the existing silos of excellence between communities in order to promote cooperation and coordination amongst the broad community of CPS designers and users across different sectors for better connecting industry's needs to research capabilities and allowing researchers to begin tackling those cross-domain CPS challenges. So, as identified by the stakeholder community through a series of workshops and workshop reports, including strategic R&D opportunities for the 21st century CPS and designed in cybersecurity for cyber-physical systems, there's a critical need here for a common lexicon, taxonomy, and a common architectural vision to help facilitate interoperability between the elements and systems and promoting communication across the broad breadth of the stakeholders in the CPS community. This need was also identified internally at NIST early in 2013 or late in 2012, and as a result, a cross-lab group was convened to develop a draft notional CPS reference architecture. Now, before I get into any of the next slides, I want to begin with a caveat that all the material here is draft, and we're really excited for the public working group to take this definition and notional reference architecture as a starting point and one of many inputs to begin developing a consensus definition and reference architecture. So the CPS notional definition, very similar to David's definition. CPSs are hybrid networked cyber and engineered physical elements co-designed to create adaptive and predictive systems that respond in real time to enhance performance with varying degrees of human interaction. So these systems really, we're interested in them because they represent a key innovation-based growth engine for the industrial internet, the U.S. economy, and just society in general. A number of related CPS concepts come together under this umbrella of CPS, including industrial internet, smarter planet, sustainable cities, smart systems, machine-to-machine, and Internet of Things. So CPS is really broad, is the best way to summarize that. Again, similar to David's points, the essential characteristics of CPS, NIST came to a conclusion that they're very similar to what NSF came to. Co-design, treating cyber engineering and the human elements as integral components of a functional whole system. The integration of physics-based and digital world models to provide learning and predictive data analytic capabilities. System engineering-based architectures and standards to provide for modularity and composability. reciprocal feedback loops between the computational elements and the distributed sensing and actuation and monitoring control elements to enable adaptive, multi-objective performance, and of course the networked, secure cyber components which provide the basis for scalability, complexity management, and resilience. So this is the notional CPS reference architecture that the NIST team developed. All within the context, it's a functional multi-stack architecture, and all the layers are co-designed in the context of the physical environment. A management function, which is not depicted in the diagram, provides an oversight capability and ensures coordination and composability. The horizontal layers of the stack depict a hierarchy of functions, but does not imply that the communication is limited to the adjacent layers only. The physical environment composes the aggregate surrounding environmental conditions, influences, or surroundings. All of the layers, the horizontal and vertical, the architecture layers, which are horizontal, and the cross-cutting functions, which are vertical, are co-designed in the context of the physical environment. The vertical cross-cutting functions show the critical elements that connect the architecture layers. So these cross-cutting functions are essential to ensure that each of the architecture layers can share and act on data from other layers effectively and securely. And finally, the management function that I referenced earlier allows the ability to oversee the complexity across the CPS systems. So again, this is a starting point, a notional CPS reference architecture. So we're really looking forward to the kickoff of the NIST Public Working Group. So looking ahead, this public working group will consist of stakeholders from government, academia, and industry, and is open to all, and will be working to develop definitions and taxonomies, requirements and use cases, cybersecurity and privacy considerations, a reference architecture, and a technology roadmap. So having the breadth of representation from all the stakeholder groups, government, academia, and industry is critical to the success of this working group. So for each of the technical subgroups within this public working group, there'll be a co-chair from NIST, academia, and industry. So what you'll notice here is none of the subgroups have a specific scope or objective or goals yet. So the co-chairs are currently meeting and coordinating to discuss and develop an initial scope, objective, and goals. And those will continue to evolve as the public working groups convene and kick off later this summer. So for more information on the upcoming launch of the public working group, we anticipate the initial meetings to start in the June and July timeframe. Please contact Jerry Castellucci. He's the overall PM of the project. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you, Vicki. Okay, so we've heard from NSF, from NIST representatives on what's on their mind, and to round up the government view, we will hear from Scott Tousley. He's the Deputy Director within the Cybersecurity Division of DHS S&T.
Thank you, Tomas. I've got a few slides just to sort of illustrate some things that I'll talk through, but I won't take a whole lot of time on them. You can feel free to grab me afterwards if you have particular questions that don't come up here in the session itself, or the email is there. I helped Doug Mon run the research group for cybersecurity inside the science and tech portion of DHS, so we're different than the CS&C US CERT sort of operating face of things that are there at DHS, and different from the CIO and CISO organization. We focus pretty much exclusively on research. Dr. Dan Massey has joined us about 8 or 9 months ago from the faculty at Colorado State, in large measure to help us with parts of this. He's working for us for a couple years as an IPA, and so some of the material I'll show you here reflects what Dan's put together in a program sense. And you can reach him also for discussions in this topic. Anytime we put money into a program area, we sort of have to lay out for the decision makers in our organization, where are things today, what are we proposing to do, how are we going to make an impact? And if you look at how cyber-physical systems, and I'll just use that as the term of reference for right now, if you look at how it works, there's an awful lot of stuff in academia, there's an awful lot of stuff in industry, there's a lot of cross-play sort of left to right here as you see on the chart. The challenge, of course, is we don't have a strong architectural or systemic approach as all of these reasonably good, well-meaning individual efforts happen. And this whole thing, of course, is a large, dynamic, changing shape of different technologies, different industries and sectors, different time frames, and so on and so forth. What's interesting, and Dan actually brought this out in the discussion some months ago, is that it's not like these are system areas that you can opt out of. You're going to be operating in cyber-physical systems, and so everybody has to sort of ride along the, it's a little bit like going into an amusement park and you're going to go on the ride and take the roller coaster whether you realized that was what the ride was or not. You know, you're going to go there. What we're proposing to do is sort of marked out in red here, and it's a little bit of a full court press. We're trying to do some things research-wise with academic organizations. We're trying to engage industry fairly heavily, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We're trying to actually advance some areas more towards the front-end fundamental research, also more towards the components and then the later systems design. You know, one of the decisions we made was the system is so large, so evolving in different areas that trying to focus on just one or two specific things was simply too narrow against the problem space. So we're going to try and look at a whole bunch of these different areas. See if we can't help strengthen collaboration across some of the boundaries inherent in a block diagram like this, and try and make security a much more integral part throughout, which we think will help tie back into a lot of industry interest right now in more systemically folding in risk analysis considerations as a part of what they look at for investment, technology needs, deployment, operations, and so on and so forth. So our program basically has three elements to it here in this triangle that Dan put together. The first thing we're doing is we're working a research consortium, in this case with the automotive industry. This is something we've done in some other areas that I'll mention to in a little bit. Second is we're working through applied research with some solicitations that we've put together, partly on our own here in the second area, and partly in collaboration with NSF and a number of the partners that you see up here at the table. We think we can make some advancements in almost building code type things in the applied research area in particular, and we're actually going to be interested to see where the industry consortium takes sort of the focus of their effort, where we're providing some funding to sort of underwrite the operation of it, but the different automotive organizations bring their own direct funding into the effort, and we see where they want to go in terms of their specific research investments. The consortia is something that our particular research division has used with great success. We've had a fairly good effort with the Department of Energy in what's called TCIP-G, Trustworthy Computing Infrastructure for the Power Grid. We've also had an effort with the oil and gas industry directly. Again, in both of these cases, we are providing funds to allow the research collaboration to be administratively and program management supported. But in both cases, the money that the government has put into the effort is exceeded by a factor of 5 or 10 by the industry investment, and we're able to work through the antitrust questions, able to work through the intellectual property questions, and it ends up sparking a lot of direct benefit to the industry and a lot of secondary indirect benefits. So this model that we've used in a couple of areas looking back is the same sort of approach we're going to try and use here in the CPS area. We really have to also focus on transition into use. That's something that we work on very hard. We're actually pretty widely known for it. Again, at the Department of Homeland Security, we get very quickly asked, okay, so what's going to change on the ground when your research investment finishes out? You know, we're very heavily oriented towards applied research. So in the CPS area, we are looking for how we're going to ultimately transition the different technology, knowledge products, particular breakthroughs that might come about from it, and focus on that as quite a priority. In my case, I'm also heading up, along with a colleague of mine at S&T, the work on a national critical infrastructure security and resilience R&D plan. That's a big mouthful. It's the R&D plan that was tasked in the administration guidance from a year and 3 months ago, the executive order and the presidential policy directive. And we focused on CPS as a main sort of core theme in this research plan because CPS captures so many of the other elements that are called out in the tasking and some of the other things you see listed on there. So the national R&D plan that was called out, and notice it's a national plan, not a federal plan, so it's even broader. And this is something I'm actually going to talk a little bit with Vicki about because we think there may be some commonalities in approach between the working group in the public sense that you're doing and what we're trying to do in a more traditional planning document here. And the last thing I'll leave you with, this is an interesting thing that was published a couple of weeks ago. The administration put a lot of effort into examining sort of a CPS of humans, meaning the privacy things that are coming out as the data systems get better and stronger, as things become more and more pervasive across our society and our systems and our technology systems, our human systems, and so on. And I'm not really somebody that can go through the Podesta document in terms of some of the policy recommendations, but I think the PCAST report here that was published on the same day is good professional reading for anybody in this room, because I think 5 years from now, you're going to see the privacy questions inherently a full-blown, full element of the CPS questions that we were asked to talk to here today. So I think I'll leave this little one as a little homework for all of us to think about as we go off and leave this excellent conference. Tomas, I'll turn the floor back over.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, just within the last 10-15 minutes, there's a lot happening in the federal government within different agencies with respect to cyber-physical systems, research, and then applying those fruits in new technologies that can be used within the society. And that's also why we're glad to have this panel, is to be able to describe to you some of the priorities that are shaping the field, whether it's the basic research from NSF or the view of the sort of the framework and what are all the parts to CPS that NIST is starting to work on, as well as some of the applied activities, and putting it together into a national R&D plan for critical infrastructure. So that was a quick view from the government. The next speaker is Ulf Lindquist, Director of the Infrastructure Security Program at SRI International. SRI International is involved both with government programs but also industry activities, so he will give us a brief perspective on that from industrial side.
All right. Thank you, Tomas, and thanks to everyone for being here this late in the afternoon to discuss this very important topic. So as Tomas said, I'm with SRI International, which is a non-profit independent research institute. So there are many kinds of cyber-physical systems, and we heard the very general definitions, but I'm going to focus on transportation, also known as planes, trains, and automobiles, just because we see so much happening there right now, so much development. And keep in mind, this, of course, includes fully automated, unmanned vehicles. So why should we care about cyber-physical systems in transportation? Well, these are systems where people often ride inside or are in the path of a very fast-moving system, and a crash here can actually really mean a crash. And the blue screen of death can be exactly that. So these are systems where consequences of a failure or an attack really manifest in the physical world and can have a large impact on human health and safety. So that's why I think this is very important that we get this right. And as was mentioned earlier, safety is important, but you cannot have safety without security in these systems. If someone can break in, take over the systems, then of course all bets are off when it comes to safety. So in terms of the threat, we know that mass transit, especially rail and air, unfortunately are traditional targets for terrorism. So there's definitely threat out there. We can imagine that there are people who want to do bad things to these systems that we depend on, and that, to, like Scott quote Dan Massey at DHS, systems that we really bet our lives on. We know that there are many challenges for a stationary cyber-physical system, but the transportation systems are mobile. They move around, sometimes at very high speed. And if you have a manufacturing plant, an oil refinery, or other situations where you have stationary CPS, those have challenges, but when it comes to safety and safe shutdown, there are ways to do that. When something goes wrong, there's a safety system that can shut down the control system in a fail-safe manner, so things don't go out of hand. When the pressure gets too high in the tank, we can turn off the heat, we can let out some of the product, we can make sure there's not an explosion, basically. Of course, there are issues when these safety systems are also CPS and connected and can be hacked into and so forth, but generally this is true. However, if you look at an aircraft flying at cruising altitude, what's the safe system shutdown at that point? Same issue when you're in a car going down the freeway at 65 miles an hour. It's important that a CPS is able to maintain safety defined by that particular application, whatever that application is, even when the system is under cyber attack. And of course, related to this, as was mentioned earlier, the human operators and interaction with these systems. And that becomes especially prevalent when it comes to vehicles. You've probably seen in the news and in technical forums the incredible development that's happening on the vehicle front now. There's a lot of automation, connected vehicles, where vehicles communicate with each other and with fixed nodes in the infrastructure, in the roads. And of course, what drives this is usually safety, primarily, also to some extent capacity on the highways and such. But we believe that systems are much better than humans at making good decisions, timely decisions, when it comes to driving. We already see some advanced driver assist systems in modern cars that are on the market today. And of course, the next natural step is to relieve the driver of some of the actual driving duties. I know there are people from Google here at the Symposium. I happen to live in Mountain View, and my morning route seems to be one that Google uses to test their self-driving cars. So about every morning I find myself next to one of these white SUVs where there's a person in the driver's seat, but he's not doing anything. The car is driving itself. And of course, for a long time, we'll see a mix of these automated vehicles and traditional old vehicles, smart vehicles, vehicles with stupid drivers, and so forth. So this is all going to be challenging. And then we throw into this the mix of cybersecurity. When it's already been shown, as you've seen in the past year or two, that, and thanks to the efforts of some people in the room, that we are able to hack into traditional cars that are on the market today. And with more automation, I'm afraid we're just going to see more vulnerabilities. And then there's the whole human interaction element. How do you interact? When does the human have to do anything? And does the human really understand the full automation? We can have this situation of mode confusion that has led to some very unfortunate accidents in aviation, for example, when the pilot has one notion of what the system does and the designer had another. So we need to make sure that these systems provide robustness and resilience. We know that development is fast-paced, it's very feature-focused, it's typically not focused on security, it's focused on getting the latest and greatest features in, and we know, I think everyone in this room knows, that vulnerabilities will be introduced. It's inevitable. There will be vulnerabilities and they will keep being introduced even if they are patched. We know patching and updates are difficult in CPS, but even if we can do that, there will be new vulnerabilities in the updated software. So our systems need to have strong robustness and resilience properties so that they can operate under attack, that they can bounce back after attacks, and limit the scope and effect of vulnerabilities and attacks. So some of the things we want these systems to have are capabilities in self-healing, to be able to do some isolation and repair we know the concept that was introduced 10 or 15 years ago of intrusion tolerance, that even if you attack some part of the system, maybe the important safety functions can still go on. So some of the research areas are verifiable security properties. What properties can we define for a system, and how can we actually verify that it has those properties? We want to look into automated attack detection, diagnosis, and response on the fly. So just to wrap up my introduction and summarize some of these challenge areas, metrics, for example. We don't have a good system to measure security of general systems, and we certainly don't have it for cyber-physical systems. How can we compare two systems? How can we, when we make a change, introduce some security supposed improvement, how can we verify that security actually was improved? I mentioned the human-computer interaction. Testing in general for systems with very low failure rates, when we require a long time, very long time, hopefully, between any catastrophic failures. How can we test and verify that? How can we, if you require a billion hours between failures, how can you test that for 10 billion hours with a number of systems and so forth? What are the safe states? We already talked about what does that mean in transportation. Robustness and resilience, as I mentioned. And also, CPS environments have very specific requirements, often when it comes to cost, especially in the vehicle market, that include weight of the system, in cars, in planes, space vehicles, also known as satellites and so forth. Power can be very limited. Connectivity can be challenging. Sometimes you have connectivity in a mobile system, sometimes you're out of radio range, and the system still needs to be able to operate autonomously. So these are just some of these challenge areas, and then finally, we've talked all about technology, but there are policy issues as well when it comes to modern cyber-physical systems. Who's really in charge, and who should get the speeding ticket when your automated car goes too fast? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ove. And so for our final panelist, we will hear from Mark Tehranipour. He's Associate Professor at the Electrical Computer Engineering Department, University of Connecticut, and also Director of UConn Chase Center and Comcast Center of Excellence in Security Innovation. As an accomplished academic, he said he can speak for 5 minutes or 5 hours. So we'll see if and how much you can put into the next 5-10 minutes.
All right, thanks, Thomas. So when Thomas asked me to come and join the panel, I knew I was the only academic researcher here, and I was thinking I have several hats, so which one should I take with me to come? And I realized that I could actually use all 3 of them. So as a researcher myself and then director of 2 centers at UConn, basically put my slides together, and more than probably what everybody else has, but I'll try to finish it in that 10 minutes that Thomas gave us. Being the last presenter, some way things are a little bit easier for you because now all the backgrounds are covered, so terrific job on those presentations. Learned quite a bit as well, but in the meantime makes it very difficult for you to present something new that is different and give a different perspective. Having a background on hardware security, when you look at the cyber-physical systems, very often we start talking about the very high levels of abstraction, and very often we forget that what makes the systems are those teeny tiny devices that we have to design, and we make sure that those devices actually work perfectly. So all of the examples are given by the panelists. I could go on and talk about all of the different physical systems, and I could even think about the Internet of Things, because that's coming as well. A lot of devices that are connected together, etc. But as I said, when you look at the every system, it starts with the integrated circuits, and I see some familiar faces in the room that I know care so much about integrated circuits. Very often we build a system, later on we go back and say, gee, is this secure? what we wanted to do in this community of a hardware security per se is to start from looking at the circuit and say, well, is this secure before I actually could continue? One of the new projects, new MURI projects that we started at UConn and UMD and Rice is just to answer that one question, that when we start thinking about even a new device, let alone just the integrated circuits that you see over here, think about a transistor. And as you start thinking about power that Ulf mentioned, and you bring it down to that small scale, and you think about reliability and performance, etc., when do we start thinking about security at that level as well? Can I change the parameters in a way that later on when I build my system, I actually have much better time? Very often we build the system and then we start asking that question. We want to start asking that question at the very step of the process when we start thinking about putting the system, which is our basically a circuit, together. The challenge is that now we have, there are different numbers, 800,000 different type of chips in the market. So you want to make sure all of them are secure. They go into different systems. They go into PCBs. You hear very often these PCBs are being attacked, cloned, and then, let me just, going backward, there you go, used to Apple Mac. And then goes to cars. Ulf gave an example of, automotive, but many of you may find it surprising to know that in 2014 cars, we may have up to 1,000 microcontrollers. So 1,000 microcontrollers, everything is being controlled. And many of these microcontrollers are actually talking to each other. And if assuming that these are, and many of them I know we work with Freescale Semiconductor design and test some of their microcontrollers, they're the same microcontrollers are being used. If one of them is compromised, that means all is compromised and they can easily be communicating with each other. Another major concern that I have actually is the fact that we build system based on many of the commercial off the shelf. We just go to market and grab a system and then use it. But the reality is that who built the system? Who put them together from the transistor to the chip to the PCB to your system that now you're using in the cyber-physical system? That is a major challenge. That takes me basically to that big question that I often ask in the supply chain areas, especially at the hardware community, where I often show this example and say, what that dot is. And that dot is, I'm not going to challenge people here, but it's the answer to the question that says, who really designed those IPs for us, the ICs, and then put the PCB together and then made the whole system together. But if you look at the way things are done today, it's very different. It's globalization that is impacting the way we build the system. So when we start thinking about that big idea, it goes all over the place, and then in RTL, and then design, and then the fabrication, assembly, test, packaging, putting into a PCB, and somebody else in another country does the PCB for us. Is that trusted? Am I going to be able to build a CPS basically for it, but not knowing exactly what that system is? And a lot of other issues associated with it. So one of the things we do in the center is basically do all sorts of vulnerability analysis. I could give you several examples, actually 2 examples. One is the domain of electronic components, where we look at the supply chain and then say, what are the vulnerabilities associated with those? So if you look at the process from design, what I like to call them from design to resign, from the beginning when you have the idea all the way when you try to when you throw away your system, you think that everything is fine, they actually find their way coming back to the market. But in the process, from the fabrication, assembly, distribution, system integration, etc., there's a lot of issues associated with it that cause trust problems, security problem. I'll talk about cloning, etc. One of the examples is hardware trojans, which could easily come into the systems, and including CPS, which basically what it does is it allows adversary to get access to our system. And examples of it, you probably read articles about it. If not, go to a webpage that is NSF-sponsored webpage, actually called trusthub.org, where you get a lot of stories about different type of hardware attacks that have been carried out to many systems. And they basically could get access to your system and be able to control it, send information, receive information, etc. Another one basically would be some sort of a, we call them time bomb, where they can easily cause problem into your system. One of the things that it really concerns me a lot when I look at the way we design our systems is concept of tampering and cloning Cloning is on the rise. You're going to get a system you think is yours, but believe me, you need to double check. I often give an example of a laser system. If they work with a company, state of Connecticut, laser system could be which is as big as my office, is being completely cloned and redesigned and fabricated. It has same specification and everything in China. And they're selling under the name of that company. Now you go get that system, put it into your own system, and not knowing that this actually could have a lot of, it's been compromised and a lot of other things that come with it. So I take a different hat now, and one of the things we do in the Comcast Center of Excellence is a vulnerability analysis. We can't, unfortunately, name what devices, etc. we get, but you kind of guess what Comcast is, and not many people know how much actually Comcast, we always look at Comcast as a cable provider, but the reality is that Comcast has one set-top box or router or gateway or home security device in your home. So when you think about it, we're talking about millions and millions of devices that they have. And those devices could easily be tampered. So when we get those devices in the center, we basically put them into a system that Comcast allows us to get access to and do all sorts of vulnerability analysis. We have a long list of vulnerabilities that we basically go through that checklist. And very often, we start adding more to it because there is a group of researchers at UConn that are doing all sorts of stuff. Then we basically take them and then try to implement it on Comcast devices. Just to name a few, we do a lot of tampering, we do reverse engineering, we do theft analysis, we do hardware security, we do black box tests, as Ulf mentioned. We do a lot of tests on those devices to actually see whether they can tolerate some of the attacks that we carry out, and then we do white box tests. We really go inside, identify the chips, identify the system, get into the software, go to the firmware, get them out, and analyze them, put them back again, act like a good device, etc. So we do all of that and see what the result look like. Unfortunately, I was told to get all of that information out, but you kind of guess what sort of vulnerabilities we're talking. So this is a system that we have to look at. This is the Internet of Things or cyber-physical system that you basically put all of these devices communicating with each other, and all we do is we look at the vulnerabilities. It's about 10, 12 faculty working together on this and analyze it at all levels of abstraction. I'm almost done. Another thing we do, this is again part of the Comcast Center of Excellence on the supply chain assurance, where we're really now going down to the hardware level there, and then after analyzing their supply chain, then we start basically developing new solutions. Working with industry, cost is key. We have to bring down the cost as much as possible. I'll only give an example. In the bottom right, we actually developed a technology that allows them to be able to keep track of every device that leaves their inventory and does the authentication, identification, etc., goes from inventory to inventory, installer to installer. They would know exactly where the device is, who had it the last time. It addresses their theft problem, it addresses their tampering problem, etc. And they wanted it, for example, something below 50 cents. Now you basically put it the whole system, but you have to bring the cost down. I'm going to skip a few slides because the work we do with Comcast, we need to also keep NIST and NIST framework in mind. And a lot of projects that we have in the center, basically we try to see which of those important NIST functions they're being addressed by the projects. So I'm going to skip a few of them and get to the couple of the slides that they have on the challenges. Ulf did help me out here. He mentioned about metrics. Metrics are important. When you do vulnerability analysis, security analysis, are there ways that we could actually evaluate to see how secure the devices are? And we know it's a moving target, but what do we do today is important. Be able to tolerate the attacks. Very often we talk about security, but the reality is that security, reliability, quality, and resiliency, they all have some relationships here and there. Very much so we think about security, but the reality is that some security challenges could actually be a quality problem, or they present themselves as a quality problem, and we might have already some solutions there. So we may want to analyze those vulnerabilities as well, and then focus on what the real security problems are. Security assessment at all levels of abstraction. We do device, we do system, we put them into bigger system and then try to analyze them. That's what we need to do. I need to mention a couple of work done. One is the supply chain vulnerability analysis. An interesting program is out from DARPA called DARPA Shield. They're supposed to design a It's supposed to be just once and goes on every device, every chip, allows us to be able to keep track of where it is. So very interesting program. Another, when again, I go back to Wolf mentioned about industry consortium, etc. Speaker before that, NSF STARS, the interesting program, brought a lot of semiconductor companies and EDA companies together to really work together to address this big problem. So it's important we look at the consortium activities at UConn and Chase. We also have a consortium of several companies, and those numbers are increasing. In terms of CPS, taxonomy was mentioned earlier. Best practices, we really need to put best practices out there too, so people will see. If you look at TrustHub as an example, we have a lot of benchmarks, we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of hardware platforms, etc., for people to try it out, to use it. I think for CPS we need to do the same as well. And let's not, I'm from academy, I can't leave this podium and say, not talk about education. We definitely need to put more focus on education at all levels, from the science of security at the low level to the higher level. I'll leave a couple of items out there, and I'll talk about it as we get the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I hope you are all thinking about some questions or comments that you would like to make. In the meantime, just put the names up again so that it's clear. But I think, you know, the challenge is clear, right? We are heading towards, in a big way, to a CPS world. There are just too many opportunities in manufacturing, in transportation, in healthcare, in agriculture, you name it. Huge opportunities for, you know, improving efficiencies, for new products, new services that will, you know, improve societies. But the challenge is those systems have to be also secure and cyber secure. And so the challenge is, right, how does this community work on these problems with the traditional, you know, cyber-physical communities that often even speak or approach the problems in different ways. So it's a challenge for collectively, for communities to come together and figure out ways to secure these systems. You know, if you talk to the people who design these systems, traditionally, you'll hear a lot about control loops and control theory. Well, that's not really a language of the community here, but those two bodies have to come together to solve these problems. So it looks like we have already some questions in mind. We'll start with the gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, Jim Plasqualik, University of New Mexico. You know, given all the threats, right, that you guys covered very well, from hardware to software and cyber-physical systems, I'd like to get the opinion of each of the panelists in terms of what they think, right, the most important step or component or process would be in, you know, for securing our current cyber-physical systems and our future ones, right? Is it something that would be hardware-oriented? Mark had mentioned a couple things regarding giving devices identities, right? Much like we have identities in DNA, right? Do we need to have that level of security to provide cars? I mean, come on, I mean, you know, I'm not going to be one of the first adopters of the Google car that drives itself until people prove to me that, you know, you can't be internet hacked, right, and have a massive accident, right, that's caused by some hacker or a terrorist. Anyway, I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Okay, should we start with Mark here?
Oh, okay, well, it's a question, give you a lot of different answers. I think the one that I think about is supply chain. Supply chain for hardware, supply chain for software, supply chain for many other components of the CPS. If we take control of what's going on in the supply chain, I think it's going to may have a major impact on improving the security of our systems.
It's a very good question. It's like picking your favorite child. I'll have to say that risk management, I think, is a key component. Understanding that cybersecurity risk management is like any other business business process. It depends on what the threat is. It depends what your asset is. So knowing, identifying, I guess as Mark had in his slide from the cybersecurity framework, identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering, having that process in place for cybersecurity is really critical.
So I'm actually glad you asked that question, because I had, listening to our academic, just go, man, we're in trouble. Yeah, there's just we're bleeding everywhere, as it sounds. And so the question is really, where do you start? And, you know, in a sense, what you have to do is look at both what is practical and what can actually prevent issues. And so the supply chain is difficult because it's such a large problem. And the supply chain, frankly, you've already got so many systems in place already. So you can look at can you fix it going forward? But so the question in my mind is really taking advantage of the fact that these systems have to interact with the physical world, and looking at novel ways of detection, as well as adding some resilient or other capabilities to define what can the system do, how can I achieve a safe landing with the system, what kind of behaviors can I implement through software that become essentially add a level of safety and security into these systems. So in a sense, I'm looking at the detection side, which the physical world, I think, can help with, and the fact that I think we can make some progress in that direction.
So when it comes to the very first steps to take, they may not necessarily be so research-oriented. One technological thing is the low-hanging fruit, which relates to device authentication that you mentioned, for example. In a network, in a car or a plane, it's assumed that if a device is on the network, it's authorized to be there, because there was no outside connections in the past. So that's something that, you know, is relatively easy to fix, more of an engineering issue than research, perhaps. Other things, you know, as was illustrated in recent car hacking efforts by Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, they used diagnostic messages that are meant to be used in a workshop. When the car is in for service, they sent those messages when the car was driving down the freeway, and it accepted those messages, things like that. So there's some things that can be done there. But then also, we need to make sure that we, as a security community, involve and educate, as Tomas mentioned, the people who are more on the automation side of things and build these systems. And there are several efforts that have started to do that. There's the DHS effort with an automotive consortium that Scott mentioned. For aviation, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics have just formed a cybersecurity working group, for example, to educate their industry on what the cybersecurity issues are. So some efforts underway. But then, in addition to that, we have, of course, all the really hard problems that we all listed, and we'll take some more research.
I think it might be feedback, and I don't mean in a controlling sense, but in an awareness sense. You know, if you look out there at some of the best organizations in any field, they're organizations that somehow manage to couple all of what they do and operate into sort of continuous improvement and adaptation things going forward. The old sports team analogy of the really good coaches can take your team and beat you with your team, not just their team, because they've got simply a way of sort of going back and forth within the activities that they have now and continuously make them better. And I think since we're going to be leaking or bleeding or faced with some of these challenges, no matter what and where, it's the organizations that have feedback systems to sort of make them continuously better from a design and operations and improvement sense, et cetera, that may be the single best thing to focus on.
Great, thank you.
Add to that, in regard to hardware or software, there's a very simple observation that hardware devices being put into cars now will still be on the road 20 years from now. And with software, you can do a dynamic patch, download it or something,
But if there's 1,000 chips in a car, there's no way that you can economically change that without just scrapping the car essentially and starting over. So it seemed that there'd be an urgent priority that when new kinds of physical interactions and new kinds of physical devices are added to cars, that security considerations be given a much higher consideration than they are right now. And that should almost sort of preempt everything else going on, because that's going to be a legacy going forward for decades. So no matter how good a job we do at software security, if it's based on CAN bus or something like that, which has got inherent insecurities in it, there's no way you can fix it.
Okay, so we have a vote here, strong vote for hardware security first. Mark, you're the hardware expert here.
Sure.
Want to take a comment?
Well, I think you touched on a very, very important point here. I was actually, as other speakers were talking about it, I wrote down here for myself legacy, because that's exactly what it is. When we think about CPS, very often we don't think about the fact that CPS actually is usually targeted for systems that have a very long lifetime. And think about automobile application. We work with Frisco Semiconductor and their microcontrollers, and 20 years is their lifetime, making sure devices are going to last that long. Now, that's a reliability problem, but when it comes to security issues, today's parts are tomorrow's legacy components. If we don't do it right now, we're going to go back again and deal with those issues. We have to come up with ways to make them more secure. The reason I answered that question by Jim Plasquale supply chain was just exactly that. We can't make every device that goes out to be very secure. The reason is because at time zero, I think this device meets certain specifications or security metrics if we have that metric in place. But the reality is that 5 years down the road, that device may actually be compromised, not necessarily with hardware. So the good thing about hardware is that you can go back and then basically change it. However, it could be subjected to side channel attacks. If side channel attacks do better, they could do better, even though you think that you actually covered it, but 5 years down the road, there are much better attacks that would do that. And that's where the software can come in to help hardware. You can't go back and try to take all of those hardware out and then address the problem. So I agree with you. It's a major challenge. The fact that if you could do your best, whatever best means, you have to have a metric in place to know what you're trying to protect those devices against. I showed that supply chain, there are costs associated with each of those vulnerabilities. Once you know what the mitigation processes are, you can address some of the issues. Believe me, we actually do some of the tests on these devices that come to us. They have no security mechanism whatsoever. I mean, forget about even just the ID in it. There's nothing in there. And you could easily open the device. You can easily put anything in the device, put it back again, put it into the system. It could do a lot more than what it's supposed to do. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a major, major problem when it comes to addressing hardware at time zero.
Any other comments on the hardware?
Well, I just want to add to Jim's comment about systems being on the road for 20 years. It's even worse because right now the chips that are being designed for cars are being designed for model year 2020. That's the lead times in development of the basic chips that go into cars. So they are being designed now, and then after that they're going to be on the road for 10, 20 years. And when it comes to software, where's the chance where we can actually do upgrades and security patching? I'm not sure you want Patch Tuesday for your car, but that's going to happen. We need to make sure, of course, that those updates are secure, because that could otherwise be an excellent channel for an attacker to put something nasty in there.
Great. Greg, you've been patient. Over to you.
Thank you. So Greg Shannon from Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. Scott and Ulf, I'm particularly interested in your answer to this question in the vein of what we do first. What have you seen as examples of hope, promise, success, if you will, that you think that can be used as an example that really, a qualitatively producible example of, success in the area, a physical system. A lot of times people will reference NASA, for example, or other systems where, millions or billions of dollars were invested, and that really doesn't work if your 50 cents is, per part is your budget. So I'm curious, where have you seen possibilities that of success? Because there's, in my sense, too much doom and gloom. What's
Right. Yeah, this is the opportunity to say that, you know, the sky is falling, there is no hope, and so forth. But okay, so let's try to look at the positive. So I think there's some promising developments when it comes to hardware solutions. Actually, we've seen that in industrial control systems, for example, the so-called bump-in-the-wire devices that you put between the legacy insecure system that was never designed to really communicate with the outside world, and you put something in front of it, whether it's an encryption device, application firewall, or something that really takes care of most of the security issues, and you can still live with having that old insecure system behind there. And there are similar things being developed actually for cars, for example, and encryption boxes that you can put in there. But I think there's, unfortunately, as we know, it's so easy to build a system without security and just make sure that it works and worry about security later, which is not good. The other, I guess, glimmer of hope is in the successful partnerships that we've seen. Scott mentioned the logic effort with where DHS works with the oil and gas industry, for example. That's been going on now for more than 5 years, and they have done some successful projects in cyber-physical systems where they have evaluated the security risks of various solutions, come up with recommendations for the industry on how to use, for example, safety systems that I mentioned earlier, and wireless control systems and so forth. So I think there's some hope in that we see that kind of collaboration actually works when we get the researchers together with the practitioners and those who own the systems and the problems, and together work on solutions.
Okay, thank you. Let's go over to gentleman in the middle.
Hi, John Dilley from Akamai. Enjoyed the thoughts there. We definitely have complex systems with many complex interactions going from software, hardware, firmware, software. And going back to something Scott said, I don't think security can be bolted on. I don't think anyone in this room would suggest that. It needs to be designed in from the start. Ulf, you made the comment that vulnerabilities will be added in, I captured it in a feature-focused design. And that's really the core of my question. We've kind of been talking around it a little bit already, but there's a trade-off between security of systems and the feature set, the time to market, and ultimately the cost of development of that. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we in industry or in government or elsewhere can balance the decision to for making appropriate level of security, especially in a low-cost oriented model, a low bid wins model. Consumers have cost as a metric that in considering various types of quality, cost is absolutely comparable brand to brand, but other aspects like security or reliability are less tangible. So in a low cost, low bid, low price model, how can we ensure that the investments are made appropriately and they're able to be recouped by those who make them? In other words, how can we align the incentives of development to market?
One possible answer, maybe we can't.
So who would like to start on the panel here?
I think it's an interesting conundrum you bring up. I mean, you're really asking, what is the ROI of designing in cybersecurity? And that's a really tough question. I think we're in initial stages. The fact that cybersecurity is on the front cover and it's being discussed, that's a first step in ensuring that cybersecurity is a design consideration, or even part of, overall risk management within your organization, within your product, within your system. So it's a starting point. But when can we get to the ROI where I can say, I spent $5 on cyber prevention, where's my $5 or $10 back? $5.01 back. That is a really hard question that I don't think, at least I don't know the answer to.
So, one of your points is just growing complexity and features in systems. And to some degree, that's an area that has been looked at for, across many different programs, including things at DARPA, other military. And in the consumer world, the real question is, what does the public demand? And the public, I think, demands the features and presumes security. And the only way to...
Until the risk becomes loss.
That's right.
It's just a risk. It's intangible.
Right, because there's no perceived cost to it till you have some actual incident.
Yeah.
And in which case, what you almost need to do is create incentives or create disincentives on the production of insecure systems. That's maybe one way to deal with it.
This almost comes back to metrics and our ability or difficulty in measuring risk and return on investment for security. If we look at what drives the whole vehicle automation trend, it's the fact that we have 30 to 40,000 deaths on our highways in the U.S. every year. People have a vision of a zero fatality highway system where everything is automated, which is fantastic, but can we measure the risk of new fatalities due to problems with those automation systems or cyber attacks on them? And we know how difficult it has been all along to get a real estimate of the security threat and the consequences. But I think one thing that's really come out of what we've said so far in the panel is that cyber-physical systems are not IT systems. They should not be treated as such, and not in the development either. I mean, we know about the very rapid development of IT systems, and your an app or your computer crashes, and that happens. It's just annoying, but as I mentioned, it's very different when it's a system that you bet your life on. And then, of course, no one really likes to mention it, but we know that for automotive, we know that regulation was what got the automotive manufacturers to focus on safety back in the late 60s, early 70s. And maybe something like that is required for this field as well.
I think one combination of things that may help us over time in this space is, I think what's going on now that's different than 5, 10, 15 years ago is, you've got major companies, all of the industries, seriously trying to figure out risk in a connected world, whereas before they sort of talked about it in specialty areas, but it was not a boardroom discussion, and now it is, and that's new. There is more and more ability to some extent, analyze the complexities of the system you're talking about, what you're operating, and to learn from it. And hopefully we will keep learning from our own operating experience. I know the insurance industry is working extremely hard to suck data out of that operating history to underwrite and to justify the market they see in providing a much more effective insurance outcome, like you have seen in other industries going back in prior decades before we all got wired in and connected. So if we're fortunate, the networked world, more awareness, more data, more business interest in it, the fact that clearly a system crash of some kind in any industry could be much larger in scope than, say, 10 years ago or more. Hopefully that combination of things will make the system more resilient than some of our technical forecasting is suggesting now, because we obviously see all the problems and the technical issues.
If I may add to the discussions, we need to also consider the adversarial model when we talk about this. You know, the sophistication of the adversary is very important. You do, for any system, we look at the specification and we do vulnerability analysis. And then given the vulnerability analysis, you try to address some of the threats. I'll give you an example of, for example, what work we do with Comcast is we don't want an average user to know how to break into a system. That's, and you look at the knowledge that adversary, whether it's a user, whether it's a consumer or a bad guy has, versus the impact. And that goes back to the discussion that Victoria mentioned about risk. If the impact is high, but the security threat is so easy to learn and apply it, that's where the industry wants a solution and wants, and those are basically the ones that usually end up being low-cost solution, because I use the term 95 plus 5. I address 95% of the problems, I leave the other 5 out. If the adversary has all the resources to be able to attack my devices, so be it. Well, I won't say that, but the companies that many tend to put it that way. But very often you find very low-cost solutions that addresses major security threats that we never thought they would be addressed that easily. But because during design we never took security into account, you see examples like Uwer's example where somebody was able to get access to somebody else's camera and the person is in and you could easily send a message, etc. Those could be addressed a lot easier, but it's never taken into account before.
Great, thank you. Let's go over to this side, to the lady.
Sorry, my name is Anuja Sonalkar. I'm from Batal. I work at CAVE, which is the Center for Advanced Vehicular Environments. And as a security practitioner who is now in the automotive domain, I wanted to just share a perspective and encourage everybody here how to think in the automotive space. It is, as everybody said, it's a very unique space. It is a cyber-physical system, but within cyber-physical systems, it has its own uniqueness. So, for example, every car is owned by a different individual. So it's under a different administration, if you want to think of it like that, against a fleet of aircrafts and other cyber-physical systems. So that is a very different constraint compared to the others. Also, think of the adversarial model. When we typically talk about an adversarial model, we're thinking of all the porous surfaces, all the attack surfaces for a given entity and how we can penetrate that. But along with that, for an automotive system, think about the uniqueness of the user and how that marries into your adversary model. You cannot lock out a legitimate user from using his car, and by using his car, I also mean if something's wrong with your car and you need to get a part changed, you don't have to necessarily go to the dealer. You can go to Joe, the car mechanic at the end of the street, or if you're handy enough, you can make changes yourself. It's called the right to repair, and our government gives us that. There's an SAE regulation that allows you to do that. So think of the legitimate user who is plopping parts in and out of his car to make his car work. After you buy a car, he's trying to make his car beefier. We've seen that. So you have to incorporate those legitimate cases also in your adversary model. So the adversary model is far more complicated than your typical, bad guy is trying to penetrate your system. It's also don't keep the good guy out from his ownership of whatever the resources, and that's the car in this case. James pointed out something I wanted to touch base on that as well. Cars have a very long lifetime, and they're on the road for a very long time. But don't think of it as a single entity. A connected car may be one entity from a macro perspective, but from a micro perspective, it's got multiple interconnected devices inside it that are communicating. And each of those parts has a different lifetime. So those can be taken out, put back in. So hardware security, when we say we want to do hardware-based security here. Think of the provisioning that goes into a hardware device. You plop, a system is fully working, the manufacturer gives you all keys installed, TPMs, maybe something, they work together fine. You pluck one thing out because its lifetime is over and you put something else in. Now that new part has to be able to work with coexisting parts. So these are challenges. I mean, they have to be incorporated into the picture. So I'm actually just dicing all the different layers and telling you that cross-functional approach. We're talking physical sensors, we're talking legislation, we're talking about adversary model, very, very different from typical systems. And I wanted to introduce this great audience to that kind of thinking process. So also think about, when we say security, we think, oh, we can do encryption, we can do crypto, we can do access control, we can do hardware security, all of these things. But also think of security as robustness. So without incorporating any of these traditional cryptographic mechanisms, can we harden the vehicle so that we can actually make it less penetrable to an adversary, so that it strengthens the case for a legitimate user to continue to use this car without being blocked out, and all these other cases of plopping parts in and out. So think of casting the security problem as a robustness problem from a control systems theory point of view. So, I just wanted to add that and share that, and get the panel's perspective. When you have an overarching theme like this, where the government wants to come in and help solve this problem, that is fantastic. The auto industry is a very, very slow-moving industry, a lot of inertia. So, like you said, when legislation comes in, they start looking at safety, and traditionally that's how they do things. And with cybersecurity also, that's how they're going to start doing things. How do you propose, when you look at the problem and all the different layers here, how do you propose that we go constructively about it? How do we, it's very complicated, even for this one cyber-physical system, cars.
Great, thank you. Any reactions or comments?
I think it was a great set of points, and in fact, I like the control system analogy in terms of robustness that you're addressing. I think it's, when you start to look at CPS security, you start to look at what are different avenues of approaching the problem, and robustness in control systems is certainly one.
I also agree completely with what Anu just said, and the aspect of cars where you have as she said, every car is owned and operated by a different person, and we can't think in traditional security terms. How do you alert a driver to an ongoing cyber attack? You pop something up on the dashboard. What are they supposed to do about that? Questions like that sort of really turns around our traditional view of how we deal with security.
Great, thank you. Let's go to lady in the middle, Cynthia.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Irvin from the Naval Postgraduate School. In the physical world, time and location are two of the most important measurables. To what extent, especially in this transportation context, are secure time and secure location, i.e. secure GPS, taken either as axioms, or is this part of the context of the research?
I think those would make very interesting research challenges that could be part of a CPS security solution.
I think in general it's about securing the information you get from sensors in some way, because we've all these automated or driver assist vehicles, they depend on a number of sensors to look at the environment, and there are ways, of course, to trick those sensors. Heard a talk at DEF CON where someone analyzed this and talked about things like painting a hole in the road to make the car believe that there is a hole in the road when there actually isn't, and things like that. So I think, and we've seen GPS spoofing and so forth. So, and I think this relates to what David said about relying on properties of the physical world. We need to make sure that that information that the system gets about the physical world is trustworthy.
And look at things like orthogonality of sensing. sensing in different domains and fusing that information together in terms of creating more reliable or more robust capability.
Okay, over to you, gentlemen.
Hi. This is Jim McDonald again from Kestrel Institute. I was struck by Anuja's comment about TPM. There might be an excellent analog in the hardware system. If when you turned on the key to your car, if the first thing that happened was a TPM-like process so that every component of the car was verified before the car would actually start and fire up and start moving. That's the kind of thing that could be enforced by regulation. And then if Joe goes to the guy down the street and swaps in a part, the car won't start unless it satisfies the constraints that are dictated by the TPM mechanism, the trusted platform. So each component as it fired up would have to provide some assurance that it was doing the right thing, or that it had the right provenance or any other kind of security consideration that you would want to build into it.
Sounds like digital rights management.
Yeah, maybe, but the point is, you know, if you had a counterfeit chip, or if you had a defective chip, or if it was miswired or something, the system would catch that at the earliest possible moment. That's the idea.
Just a comment on that. When you turn on your car and you turn off your car, there is a few milliseconds that actually car tests itself. So I can't tell the numbers, but it runs a test on every chip and every system. And when you turn off the car, it actually a bit longer. But it does that test. But you bring an interesting point that you don't want to just do that for quality purpose. You can also do it for your reliability and security purpose as well, which is actually very interesting.
Great. Let's go over to this side.
Peter Chen from Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, CERT. Basically, I'd like to have each panelist predicting of the future, particularly about what kind of disaster mostly likely to happen for the cybersecurity, cyber-physical system in the next 5 years. Now, the reason for my question is because we always want to get funding, and then the funding agency usually say, your scenario, never happened. Give you some example, like a biological attacks. People say, never happened. Even it happened very serious. Okay? Now, I'd like, if you may, predicting about the next 5 years, which one you think would likely to happen any place in the world, which have serious impact of the people's life or whatever. Anybody want to try that? 5 years later, we can come back to see whether your prediction is correct or not.
Well, I'll take a shot at it, but make a joke out of it too. You watch Star Wars, right? And clones. Very often I raise this in hardware community. What really keeps me at night is actually clones, especially when it comes to chips and systems. And we make the same device. In our center right now, we're actually testing some of these clones chips. They have the same look, same pins, same package, same specification. But they could do something more than what they're supposed to do. So, and when they build this, they make millions of them. Think of it as devices that goes into very critical applications such as power grids. And they are able to get access to the power grid, not necessarily to network and software rather now. There's a hardware in there that is helping them out. And that's really a major concern, that you go and buy chip from company X, but the reality is that it's a clone, and there's a malicious circuitry on that as well. And I can give you a lot of examples of dealing with these clones in our center. And one interesting example of it actually was there's a chip that, this is not clone, but there's a chip that when we did the analysis, we actually saw another die on top of the actual die. In other words, the chip got open, and then they put the additional die on top of it, and then they repackaged them again. Those are the chips that they could really hurt systems, because now you have a microprocessor on top of another microprocessor and doing malicious thing. So that keeps me at night when I think about it.
Any other doomsday prophecies?
Obviously, I can't suggest where it's going to happen, but you know, if you just look at the history of electric power generation and failures in places in the system, joints between different parts of the grid and how they're managed, you know, things will happen, and you know, you can envision that happening. What I hope is that we're able to spend some time going through the no-fault after-action analysis so that we keep learning from not just failures but also near misses. We don't really do a good job of studying things that almost failed, and yet there are a lot of professionals throughout industries and sectors and so on that have a pretty good feel for how close sometimes things came. One of the things, you know, I have some military background, and one of the things that goes unrecognized in a lot of cases was a lot of the military improvement in the 1980s, 90s, and so forth was not in the hardware, it was in the organizational software, if you will, and a big part of that was going through from low-level units all the way up, relatively low threat after-action analysis, so people kept learning from the mistakes they made or their colleagues made or something in the system or whatever it happened to be. So I think we'll see some breakdowns just because the numbers would suggest that, but I hope we can learn from them in a good, smart way.
Okay, we're coming to the end, but let's take the last question over there.
Okay. Thanks. I am Alvaro Cárdenas with the University of Texas at Dallas, and I wanted to come back a little bit to the question of incentives, because at the end of the day, the state, like I think the most pressing problem we need to solve in the short term is that the current state of cyber-physical systems as they are is the fact that there's this lack of incentives for investing in security. That's the reason why if you look at the state of the power grid security, you find vulnerabilities in most places, or the state of industrial control system networks or water networks. So yeah, I wanted to pose two questions, or were two, the optimistic one and the pessimistic. So the optimistic one, I guess, as an academic, I obviously would like to encourage more people to give funding in this type of research, like to understand, like in security economics or interdependent games or correlated risks, to try to understand what is the state, what are the current failures that are happening, and how can we ideally find ways to solve them. So the pessimistic view is, at the end of the day, probably, as I think Peter Neumann mentioned, that maybe we can't do this security analysis or security incentives. And so I was thinking, at the end of the day, for example, I guess there are some analogies to, for example, to homeland security. At the end of the day, homeland security is a public good, and most of the times, I guess, whoever ends up paying for the public good is the government, because it's a market failure, because the other parties who are investing, they don't have enough, they don't receive the benefits if everyone invests. So I was wondering if there are some potential analogies to, for example, how like, for example, we protect against terrorism. Like, who pays for terrorists to protection against terrorism? So, right, it's the government, and it's not sort of like the industry developing new security mechanisms.
So one thing I would add is that we do have, at NSF, we do have a Frontiers project that is called Forces, and it's a first activity that's starting to look at what are the role of incentives in development of resilient systems. So it's looking at technologies involving the grid, the electric power grid, as well as the transportation industry. So it's a first start at looking at some science of security with incentives, but it's only a first step.
I also want to mention a program that's part of DHS S&T, where a program manager named Joe Kielman is running a program on cyber economic incentives. I don't think it's specifically focused on cyber physical systems, but it's investigating various incentives for individuals and organizations to apply cybersecurity measures.
just want to make an observation about the legal incentives. The risk to a corporation is limited by the value of that corporation. So if I'm putting a product out in the market, say my market capital, say I'm worth $1 billion, if I introduce a risk to the public that's $2 billion or $20 billion, that makes zero difference to me, because the most I can lose is $1 billion, so I have no incentive to choose the $2 billion or the $20 billion risk over the other. They're exactly equivalent. And even in a strong legal sense, because if I can give a better return to my shareholders by taking on the $20 billion risk than the $2 billion risk, I'm not a lawyer, but I think I'm legally required to do that. That's my fiduciary responsibility, is to go for the profit for the shareholders. So you need to somehow internalize that risk in a way that they can't, just sort of fall back on the fact that corporations have limited liability. So it seems like one solution would be to require insurance for security issues or these very low probability events to be handled through an arm's length transaction. So you can't the company would not be allowed to internalize the risk. They would have to get an insurance company to acquire that risk for them. And then the job becomes, let the market, let them convince some insurance company that they're doing a good enough job that the insurance company, which has got $100 billion worth of assets, should take on this $20 billion risk, where it really makes a difference to the insurance company.
But I think at the same time, there's also a fiduciary responsibility on the company to not put themselves at the risk of losing the entire business.
Yeah, but my point is, it's already taking that into account. In other words, there might be two competing strategies, where in one of them I make a $100 million profit with a $2 billion risk, or I can make a $120 million profit with a $20 billion risk. I'm going to go for the extra profit because the extra risk.
I would challenge that the board of directors of that company would say that scenario would place them in a position of jeopardy, that they would not be forced to make that kind of decision.
No, but I'm saying if those are the only two alternatives they have.
I do think one of the reasons to be somewhat optimistic, though, is that unlike as much as 5 years ago and certainly before then, I'm seeing major companies looking at the insurance equation and calculation as a part of their planning for systems that they're now recognizing are more substantial in terms of risk than they had calculated before. So,
Yeah,
the market is perhaps beginning to self-correct in the ways that we would like to see it go. So,
yeah, my argument is simply that if you force the companies to make that visible in a way, they can hide it if it's internal to the company. But if they're forced to go through an external transaction with another company, then that risk becomes visible, and it has to appear on the bottom line on that quarter. They have to pay for it.
So if we didn't say that this was complicated, now we have the lawyers involved as well. And let's end on that note. But before we give a warm applause, I want to mention, remember there's a reception, Crystal Room. It's a joint reception between the Symposium, the NITRD Program, and SRC, and the workshop that they will be hosting tomorrow at the same place. So please, when you leave, make sure you stop at the reception. And I want to thank the panel and thank you for staying and having this discussion. Hopefully we can continue at the reception. And with that, join me in welcoming and thanking everyone. Apparently, one more announcement.
So some closing comments. I guess at this point everybody's papered out and has PowerPoint poisoning, so I definitely don't want any more slides. I was asked to review and revisit all the people I've helped for the conference, or we could go through all these slides. But the point is there's really a huge amount of effort that people have been put in. It's a really incredible amount of work by the technical committee, by the program committee. We estimated each program committee member performed about 50 to 70 hours of work of reviewing papers and attending the meeting. And it's really a huge amount of work. So hopefully you have all enjoyed this, including the workshops, and I'll just briefly go through this. And wanted to say thanks for attending and have a safe trip home. Thanks, everyone.